Good morning. Welcome. I'm Tom Broadwater, and I'm Associate Lama at Columbus KTC, and I welcome you here this morning. It's great to have you here. As I said before, there are a number of really great Dharma programs going on simultaneously with this one. So I'm in competition with a lot of folks. Thank you for stopping. And hopefully what I have to talk about will be of some value to you. I hope so anyway. But let's begin by developing a really big mind, a mind that encompasses all beings, and a motivation that is equally big, a motivation that includes all beings. And I said earlier this morning, those beings include those people that are troubling us, that are irritating to us, maybe even they perceive us as enemies, all those folks. Because quite frankly, until Buddhahood, we're going to be experiencing those pretty frequently. So we might as well get used to it and include them in our aspiration that we all come to Buddhahood together. So in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, I take refuge. By the power of generosity in all six perfections, may we attain Buddhahood. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, I take refuge. By the power of generosity in all six perfections, may I attain Buddhahood for the sake of all beings. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, I take refuge. By the power of generosity in all six perfections, may I attain Buddhahood for the sake of all beings. Glorious, precious Guru, please set above my crown in a lotus moon seat. Care for me with great compassion and grant the city a body, speech, and mind. So again, thank you for coming by. We're going to talk about death and dying. When I chose this subject a couple of months ago, I thought to myself, gee, I'm wondering if this is really a good time to do that. You know, I'm really concerned about how this topic might be received. And frankly, my first thought was that it wouldn't be received very well. You know, it's like, well, there's a lot of hopeful signs on the horizon about, you know, the political situation, about the physical situation, about COVID and so forth. There are some hopeful signs. Nonetheless, we still live in a lot of upheaval, a lot of sickness, and a lot of death. And my fear was this talk might actually add to your distress. But then I got to thinking, I don't think that's going to happen. I think just thinking about this subject is actually going to be helpful and hopeful. At least that's my aspiration. So let's look a little bit at how we actually deal with things in times of distress. You and I can only speak for myself, but I'm probably you too. We crave release through distraction, and basically through that distraction, we choose not to be confronted by the reality of our current situation. The fact is that in the past year, all the major vulnerabilities we as human beings face have been manifest right before our own eyes. Most of us know someone who's been ill. Many of us know people who've not only been ill, but who've actually died. And we certainly know folks, perhaps including ourselves, who are vulnerable to this illness and vulnerable to the point of fear of death. And all of us have been isolated to some degree or another from friends, loss of jobs, loss of job security. So we're acquainted with what Kempo Karta Rinpoche calls the four limitations. And those four limitations, first of all, are birth and death. These two, birth and death, are intrinsically related dyad. Birth is a condition for death. So we're limited in that respect. The second one is a rise of popularity and fame is a necessary condition for decline. So although we may be known, be popular, and so forth, that is limited by the fact that that will all decline, that will vanish. Any meeting, and now the third one is any meeting, gathering, or joining together must occur before separation or parting can exist. So that's another limitation. And finally, any material accumulation is a necessary condition for a loss or disintegration of material goods. These are all limitations that we suffer with. And it's basically the nature of samsara, the world we live in. And during this past year, probably you've experienced at least one of them. Certainly not death, but one of the other three. But you may have experienced someone else's death. So, although we've been subjected and are subjected to these limitations, we don't like to realize them. Why is that? Well, because of our ignorance, which is both unconscious and sometimes willful. We find the truth of these facts frightening and difficult to face up to, right? So instead of grasping these truths, our tendency is to deny these realities and seek diversion and distraction in the name of entertainments. You know them as well as I do. Mine happen to be jigsaw puzzles, Netflix. I've learned to start cooking during this time. I'm not a very good cook. You wouldn't call me a gourmet cook, but I've gotten sort of into that. Eating, do a lot of that. I don't know about you, but I put on probably about 10 pounds during this period of time. And, sleeping also. I like to sleep now more often. I take more naps. And these are all diversions. And they do work for a minute, don't they? I mean, for a minute, they're okay. But when you lean into these distractions in this distressful environment, these same things can easily become addictions, leading us to even greater ignorance. And so, because of our fear and because of our endless distractions, I think we're depriving ourselves of the potential to grow. Facing them can be a challenge, but if we lean into that challenge, we can grow. So maybe this discussion about death and dying, while it may be a little troublesome at the beginning, you might say, "Oh my goodness, this is a morbid subject to talk about right now. I see enough of it." But if we can lean into that and get beyond that sort of mindset, you and I can grow a great deal as a result of our reflections on it. So let's talk about the elephant in the room. Let's talk about death. You might say it's an elephant in the room. So let's talk about it. From a Buddhist perspective, this moment is ripe for discussion. When we lean into this difficult and unpleasant situation, we're going to grow. So let's go ahead and do this. And so this is why I've chosen death and dying as a subject for today's talk. Rather than it being a frightening topic, by discussing and gaining some better understanding of it, especially from the practice point of view, we can take some of the fear out of it, and we become more acquainted. And as we become more acquainted with it, the more we can integrate it into our daily practice. And that's a good thing. That's a really good thing. When I began researching for this topic, I found two short topics by Kempo Karthar Rinpoche, which he gave over 40 years ago at the Heart Center in Michigan. You can buy these two little talks that he gave. It's a really thinly bound booklet. You can get it at the KTD bookstore on Bonzo. It's about $5. It's worth it. At the same time, I reread parts of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. With the book, the edition I read had the commentary from the Dalai Lama. I also read again a 100-page book by Bokar, Bokar Rinpoche, and it's called Death and the Art of Dying. A really cool book. It's beautifully written, and it's only 100 pages, and the instructions are wonderful. So I can recommend that book. Then there's also, and for many of you who are students of Lama Kathy, you probably at one time or another come across the Great Path of Awakening by John Cantrell. And he has some very pith instructions for folks at the time of death. And I've also read that. This whole review that I did before I actually sat down and did my talk reminded me of just how deep and how vast the Tibetan Buddhist tradition is on this subject. It's like huge. But despite all this reading that I did, I kept circling back to Rinpoche's two talks that he gave in Michigan. And they're wonderful. They're short, and they really are foundational. So basically, the talk I'm going to give today is taken from those two talks. I sort of moved them around a bit and put things in a different order, but it's basically those talks. But all those other books that I've spoken about, goodness, if you have the opportunity, the time to look at them, they remind you that our forefathers and foremothers, lamas and great realized masters, have looked directly into their own meditating minds, and through that realization, discovered some of the pristine truths surrounding death and dying and rebirth. But again, it's impossible, totally impossible to cover all that vast territory in one talk for 1 hour. Impossible. I'm also going to refer a little bit to some of the hospice work I've done. So I've experienced a couple of, in the last, not this year, previous year. This year, I've not been able to, of course, volunteer. But in the previous year, I was privileged enough to experience the death of about a half dozen individuals as a part of my hospice volunteer work. So I'll also bring that into my talk today. I'll follow a very simple outline. I'll begin by explaining how death in dying is viewed in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. Then we'll talk about the time leading up to death. And then we will describe that process as it immediately precedes death. And we will discuss then how we prepare ourselves for death. And Khyentse Karthar Rinpoche has some beautiful instructions in that regard, and we'll go over those. And finally, we'll discuss about how we can attend to other people's deaths. But to begin our talk, I really have to explain a little bit about karma as it relates to death, dying, and rebirth. And I think you'll see its relevance as we proceed here. First of all, when we look around us, we see that some people are having wonderful lives right now, even in this pandemic. They're successful, and their lives look like they're they live with relative ease. On the other hand, there are others who are right now experiencing continual failure. There is a crucial underlying factor which has affected the nature of their births and their lives, and that is the law of karma. From the Buddhist perspective, from the Buddhist view, it's wrong to think that after death is going to be reborn as me. Why? Because karmic patterns are meant in beings' consciousness. These patterns multiply and increase the variety of possible rebirths. Also, we experience the existence of these karmic patterns throughout our life. There are times when we're happy and tranquil, but they are followed by states of confusion, conflict, and afflictive emotion. So we can say without any doubt, based upon our own experience, that our experience is continually being colored by karmic patterns. In a way, in the same way, our different births are determined by karmic patterns, wholesome and unwholesome, which predominate at the time of death. These possibilities for rebirth go from the lowest realms of suffering to the human realms, where there's a possibility of enlightenment and insight. So this is the first important point. Different births are determined by karmic patterns. Itself. Again, beings experience death in one or two ways. Something catastrophic, immediate, without warning, or it can be a longer, slower process, the result of old age and sickness. We're not going to talk about sudden death today. We're going to talk about that more gradual process of death. It's what you might call the longer goodbye. So here I'm going to lean into my hospice experience, which, by the way, seems very consistent from what I've read with our lineage masters. So let's start leading up to death. So in those few months leading up to death, often the person dying comes to the knowledge that, yes, I'm dying. That understanding becomes very real to them. And the person begins to withdraw. You'll see this. They begin to withdraw. And this is the beginning of their separation from the world and then of people. The terminally ill person may say they're not up for visiting with people that they visited with regularly. You know, tell my son that today I'm just not feeling well. This is a part of the withdrawal. And they're beginning to lose interest in conversation and in people. They're withdrawing from the outside world and going into themselves. And this is very natural. It's a time when they often are reconstructing, recollecting their own lives and looking at their own past histories. A lot of times you'll notice that the dying person makes that recollection with their eyes closed. They may even take more frequent naps. But while their eyes are closed and they are sleeping more often, there's important work going on here, or at least there's important work that can go on during this time of withdrawal. And it's something that we may not be aware of. We just think they're sort of withdrawing, but there's something going on. But again, there's a less need to communicate. Uh, and words seem connected with the physical world that they're withdrawing from. Words lose their importance. And so, what's really important at this time when we're caring for a person that is dying is touch and just a wordless caring. That can be very, very helpful. Now, let's take a look at what happens 1 to 2 weeks prior to death. What happens is frequently the person that is dying is sleeping most of the time. They can't keep their eyes open. A person may start to talk to relatives, friends who have deceased, or they may talk about places and things from their distant past. Those around the dying person may not know about these things. And so it seems like, it seems a little crazy. One of the persons I was attending to, who I think also had a stroke, he was just involved in sort of a word salad. It didn't make so much sense, but every once in a while, something very clear came out about his past. And so I would sort of latch onto that and try to communicate with him about this, and that kept him going. But he was recounting things that were unknown to me. But I think also because of his stroke, it was sort of a jumbled sort of situation for him. So from at this time, what you might say is the person is starting to lose their grounding to the earth. Days and hours before death, there's oftentimes a surge of energy. The person may talk clearly and alert, whereas before they were very disoriented. This often occurs. All of a sudden they want to talk. They may request their feel. And this is an excellent time to use this energy if you're aware or if you can be helpful to the individual. If it's you or if it's somebody else, it's an excellent time to do some spiritual work, spiritual practice. But of course, that's only if that person is inclined to do that. One of the important things in dealing and attending with a dying person is not to force your spiritual beliefs upon them. That would be disturbing. So that's not a good idea. But in this energetic surge that often occurs before death, this can be an excellent time to work with the person dying. Sometimes it's not as dramatic as I'm making it out to be. It's less noticeable, but in hindsight, it's more often than not, it's there. And then right before death, the person often becomes non-responsive just right prior to death. Most of my hospice experiences have been that point where they have become non-responsive. I was attending one man who was unresponsive, and the only thing I noticed is the rise and fall of the carotid artery. I never pronounce that correctly. I think it's carotid artery, right? something like that, the carotid artery in his throat. And I saw it rise and fall. And when I saw it no longer rising and falling, I knew he was at the moment of death. So there are signs for that. So from the Buddhist perspective, and now I'm transitioning back more to what our lineage masters say. So from the Buddhist perspective, this time immediately preceding death is called the dissolution of elements. Our body, according to that perspective, is an aggregation of four elements, and they one by one are absorbed one into the other. And those four elements are earth, water, fire, and air. The earth element is more like our bones and that sort of thing. Water is, of course, the fluids in the body. Fire is the heat, the temperature of our body. And air, of course, is our wind, our that sort of thing, our inhalation and exhalation. So the earth element is absorbed into the water element. That's the first thing. And one of the signs of that is one experiences mirages. Then the water element is absorbed into the fire element. So then the mouth becomes dry and the tongue becomes dry. And there are many other signs, but I'm just giving you a few here. Next, the fire element is absorbed into the air element. And the heat leaves the extremities and migrates to the center of the body. And finally, the air element is absorbed into the individual consciousness. And outwardly, that is seen by a rapid breathing, which is interrupted with periods of rest. There's no breathing going on. Breathing will erupt, then rest for a while, and then erupt again. And then there is the final breath, and that being the dissolution of the air element. So at this time, the essences of the four elements, earth, water, fire, and air, join with the mind. And suddenly, the consciousness experiences a great sense of calmness and clarity. And that's known as the moment of clear light. This experience is not through the power of meditation. It's the result of the union of these four elements. This is something everybody experiences at death. It's not unusual. But for the devoted practitioner, the excelling meditator, insight gained in meditation could cause the recognition of the state of calmness to be actually the clear light and would cause rebirth in an enlightened state. For most of us, that is unlikely to happen. For ordinary people, the experience of the clear light becomes frightening. And in fear, they enter into a state of unconsciousness from anywhere from 1 day to 3 days. But there is one exception to this would be someone who's lived an extraordinarily unwholesome life. They may immediately enter into a hellish realm of extreme paranoia, confusion, and suffering. But for most of us, it simply we will after the clear light, we will simply go into a state of unconsciousness. Then after 1 to 3 days, there's this feeling of unconsciousness that we have. One regains consciousness and we start feeling a sense of our own body again. Of course, we don't have a body. It's just the, shall we say, the comic residue uh, of our having a body. We feel it. And there's additional feeling in this state of being buffeted about, sort of like a bubble blown by the wind. And during this time, there may be a desire to actually speak to our families and to our loved ones and so forth. So it can be a very trying time. Of course, we cannot communicate with them, nor they with us. So during this time, from 3 to 49 days, uh, we have a lot of uncertainty and confusion in the bardo. By the way, I'm not talking too much about the bardos, and the reason I'm not is because Rinpoche didn't. That would be a teaching, a later teaching, and I don't think it's terribly important for the moment. So after this period of time where these 49 days, one one starts to become drawn to future experience of birth. At this point, the consequence of our karmic accumulations from previous lives takes over, and the process of rebirth in the Bardo of becoming begins. There's a lot more we could discuss here, as I said. I barely scratched the surface of these rich teachings, and I've skipped over an awful lot. But this is what Rinpoche said in these two talks, and I think they're foundational. If we get these concepts, we can add to those by reading further, and we might even give a talk about these at some times. So now let's look at how we ourselves can prepare for death and dying. Later on, we'll look at how we can help others in this process. How do we do this? How do we do this? Well, we as Buddhists do believe in the continuity of consciousness. Consciousness continues through death and rebirth. And as I said earlier, rebirth, the rebirth that we experience in the future will be determined by the nature of our actions in our lifetime. The course, however, the course of our life is based upon what we do. We have control over that. The quality of our next rebirth, another important point, the quality of our next rebirth could actually influence the quality of future rebirths. So it's really important to keep this in mind. So let's get to the point. The point is that the main purpose of all Dharma practice, all practice, is to prepare for the future, a future to benefit other beings. That's it. All practice is for that, to benefit in the future and to benefit in a way that is going to be free from suffering and confusion. The less suffering and confusion we have, the more likely it is that we can benefit other beings. So this is the purpose, the intent of all Dharma practice. So it's important. Now, certainly we'll get positive benefits from our practice in this life. There's no doubt about that. And all of you that have been intently and intensely practicing know this. There's benefit. But the primary objective is to prepare for the future. It's an investment that assures future beneficial lives. And I'm going to tell you, it doesn't matter whether you're young or old. This view is important to keep in mind because death is uncertain, and that can happen to young or old. So again, let's look at this question. How do we prepare? Khenpo Karthar Rinpoche drew from his own experience to tell us something about what we need to do. He said, and I'm going to quote, "At this time, you are alive and have a sense of the way things are and how to get along in this world." You know, we're familiar with the world. We have some mastery over it. Soon, however, he said, you will be going into a different place and will not have any experience regarding it. You will be completely lost. This was exactly my situation when I came to America. I think he came to America in the early 70s. He couldn't speak the language. He didn't know anybody. He didn't know the customs. He didn't know where he was going to live. He just sort of like was dropped off into New York. It's really a wild story, um, which deserves going into, but we don't have the time here now to discuss it. But he literally came uh, to this country without anything to prepare him. Uh, so he says that situation he was in is not unlike the situation we're going to be faced at the time of death. So he goes on to say, if you go somewhere where you do not know your way, he says, a friend who will show you around and explain things is very important. So we need a friend. And so this is why Buddhism speaks about having an object of refuge, a friend to go to, our object of refuge. And that's why it's really important to relate to these objects of refuge. So here you might say, Rinpoche is giving us instructions regarding the end of life. The issue of refuge is very important in death and dying. We should always be mindful of those objects of refuge, and particularly at the time of death when we'll need them the most. So let's define our objects of refuge. It could be your Lama, and in my case, it's Khenpo Karthar Rinpoche. So at death, I want to be mindful of him. It could be your teacher. It could be Lama Kathy. It could be your Yidam, which is the practice deity. It could be Chenrezig, to whom you have committed time and continual practice to. Relating to the sources of inspiration is important for this life and future lives. Refuge. At the time of death, recalling our refuge. So it's important to develop a strong acquaintance to our refuge objects so that we can call upon them, take refuge in them, especially when we need them the most at the time of our death. So and here are his instructions. So as we realize or visualize our teachers, deities, and gurus as objects of refuge above the crown of our head. The crown of our head is about 4 finger widths from where, in my case, my hairline used to be, crown of my head. And you think above that is your object of refuge. So the essential point here is put some effort into practice. At the time of death, Amitabha is the Buddha of light. He is, you can see him above my head in the tanka I have behind me. He is commonly the central deity for refuge at the time of death. So we visualize Amitabha. By the way, Amitabha is the Buddha, and I'm saying this from my account. These aren't words of an enlightened master. These are my account. My account of Amitabha Buddha is that he's the Buddha who had the greatest aspiration. He said, I'm going to make it the easiest for anybody who wants to enter my pure land. I'm going to make it really easy on them. All they have to have is an intense desire to enter my Buddha field, my mandala. And all you have to enter because of his aspiration is that strong desire, that strong aspiration. So anyway, we visualize Amitabha above the crown of our head. We supplicate and then do the Amitabha sadhana if we know it. And if we can't do that, then we simply take refuge in the presence of Amitabha. And then we make a sincere aspiration that all may experience happiness and well-being, free from suffering and confusion. Furthermore, we ask that all beings, oneself included, become completely purified of the defilements and negative patterns. In a sincere way, we confess all of our defilements, at least in a general way. The good thing about the defilements is they aren't eternal, they aren't forever, and they can be purified. And at this point, this is a point of purification. So here we generally recognize them. And here's the important point. We surrender. We surrender to Amitabha, to our object of refuge. We surrender. That's really important. So what would be the result of this practice? Well, if you are able to do this at the time of death, first of all, it's going to help. That's number one. But based upon your confession and your surrender and the compassionate power of Amitabha's aspiration, he wants you in his pure land. It's possible to actually enter Amitabha's heart and become an enlightened being. Well, at least enter his heart and go into his pure land. And from there, become an enlightened being. So this surrender is an excellent practice. There's another profound practice that we can do, and it's called a POA. And it can be performed by a strong practitioner or a Lama. And basically, it's during this time between our death and rebirth, particularly in the first 3 days, while the mind still resides in the body, that a Lama, experienced Lama or experienced practitioner can actually transfer the consciousness from the body. And what results from that? Well, it depends. The effectiveness of this practice is really dependent upon two things. First, the dying or dead person's wholesome accumulations and faith in Amitabha, and quite honestly, the ability of the Lama or the practitioner that's doing POA. Having met these two conditions, transference of the consciousness into a liberated state is actually possible. But according to Khenpo Karthar Rinpoche, it's more likely our consciousness will be liberated into a better state of rebirth. And from there, in 3 or 4 lifetimes, better rebirths. That would happen in POA. Again, there are many details to this practice. And again, we don't have time to go into them, but certainly a study of them would be well worth your while. So now let's talk a little bit about how we care for dying people. The Buddhist view about how to react to other people's deaths is a little different than the ordinary view. So often, and I'm as guilty, you might say, of this as anybody else, when a close friend or relative is dying, we suffer a lot. We suffer a lot. I'm not now talking about the dying person. We suffer a lot. And sometimes people think that by expressing this sorrow very intensely around the dead or dying person is how best to show our love for the dying person. In fact, it's not helpful. It's totally not helpful. It's absolutely not helpful. We show our love for the person dying in a different way. Yeah, so it's a question of showing love. It's not a question of being indifferent. That would make the dying person suffer even more if we were indifferent to them. People who are dying need to feel like they're not being left out. So we have to find the right and beneficial attitude when we're attending a person who is dying. So you also might think that simply maintaining a peaceful mind and not being indifferent is enough, but it is not. We show love, and it should be genuine, and it should be deep. The dying person needs to feel and receive love as expressed both in our behavior and in our words. Tears and sorrow are really not the way. Bokar Rinpoche had a beautiful, beautiful way to express our love and concern for the dying person. He said, our love should be expressed with radiant peacefulness and immense concern. Wow. Radiant peacefulness and immense concern. Kindness and spontaneous simplicity. Kindness and spontaneous simplicity. We don't have to have elaborate gestures. Simple kindness, simple gestures, peacefulness that is radiant. The idea here, you're not putting your attention on your sorrow. You're putting your attention on what they need. And you do that without worry and without sadness, without regret, just love, clear vast, free like the sky. That's definitely a tall order. It's a very tall order. And sometimes it's difficult to manifest radiant peacefulness in its full measure. But at least we should do no harm. At all costs, we want to avoid disturbing the mind of a dying person. As we said, a troubled state of mind, an angry state of mind carried into the next life can cause a very unfortunate rebirth. So we don't want that as part of our karma to have caused that person by our actions to go into the next life angry or despondent. Again, the moments preceding death are critical moments. The other thing that's important too, a Buddhist person should never, ever try to manipulate the person to receive Buddhist teachings, particularly when they have no inclination to do so. Rather, attending a dying person, you should try to find out what their faith tradition may be and what their commitments are. If the person has a religious faith, you can direct their attention to their objects of refuge at the crown of their head. Jesus is above your head. He's waiting for you. Go to him. And if they're atheists or non-believers and they're not interested in spiritual discussions, then it could be that they love that have preceded them in death. They're up there waiting for you above the crown of your head. As a Buddhist, we believe that the most auspicious place for consciousness to exit is the crown of our head. So we speak to the person standing at their head, not at their feet, but at their head. And we can stroke their heads many times many times, the times that I have attended dying people, I have rubbed the top of their head. Sometimes they've even asked that a warm, a wet towel be applied to their head. And that's good. That's all good. It's a kind act. And we're doing something that is according to our own faith tradition, but it's not intrusive and it won't cause them troubles either. So it's a good thing to do. Rinpoche has recommended that, in fact. There's so much we could talk about, but again, we just don't have the time. We're running out of time. We do have a moment. If anyone has any questions or thoughts, this would be a wonderful time for that. So I open it up. Anybody, just unmute yourself and speak. I think Deborah has her hand up.
So, like my husband is not, and children aren't Buddhists. If our usual Lama is not available, who should we ask to try to help us through this stage?
What do you mean by not being available?
Well, I mean, like Lama Zopa is the Lama for our KTC, but he's at KTD right now. So he probably couldn't just drop everything and, drive to Albany and go to the hospital or house or whatever. So, barring the availability of him, who do you go to next, so to speak?
Excellent question. And what I would tell you, Deborah, is distance is not always a barrier.
Oh.
That an accomplished Lama from a distance can perform poa. Now, in this particular instance, you could ask Lama Zopa. There's whether he feels comfortable doing that. There is certainly Kempo Urgent, who's at this. So distance, to make a long story short, distance is not necessarily a problem.
Okay. Okay.
There are further instructions about how to attend a dying person that I'm not including here. But what I said is true and correct, but incomplete.
Okay. Thank you.
Anybody else? Okay. Well, it's getting that hour. I can't tell you how much I appreciate the fact that you joined me this morning, and thank you for being here. Um, let's just take a moment. We do have 2 or 3 minutes. Why don't we just take a moment and silently, with an open mind, consider all who are suffering right now and offer to them in the form of brilliant, peaceful light all that would help them, that we have, that we possess, give to them, and in turn take upon their suffering. And do this in a process of continual rotation. Let's do this just for a moment. So, by the merit of our gathering together here today, the power of being as a group, by the merit of considering our own and other person's death, and the power we have at the time of death to determine our future rebirth, by the power of our Dharma practice, may we reach Buddhahood, and may all other beings reach Buddhahood. By this same merit, this merit that we've accumulated, may wrongdoing, our enemy, be overcome. From this stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from this ocean of samsara, may we immediately free all beings. May we free all beings. May we free all beings. Thank you very much. Happy that you were able to come, and you all have a really great week. Be safe, and we will see you again, hopefully soon. Bye-bye.
Lama Tom,
Yes.
I don't know if you're familiar with this book. It's pretty recently put out. It's How to Face Death Without Fear, Lama Zopa Rinpoche. So.
Thank you, Deborah.
Okay.
Appreciate the offering.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye now.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.